Before I can solder my retention ring to my domed piece, I need to make sure that the edge of the domed piece is nice and flat. So obviously with doming, it slightly distorts the edge of the metal, which means you're not going to get a nice solder join with the retention ring. So I'm just going to use a piece of sandpaper. This is 180 grit, but you can use a little bit higher if you want to make sure that that edge is nice and flat and even. So I've put my sandpaper onto my bench. If you've got a nice sized steel block, that's a really good place to put it because it's going to be a nice flat surface for you to be sanding on. Wherever you do this, you just want to make sure that the surface underneath is as flat as possible. And then I'm just going to sand in figure of 8. So by doing a figure of 8 shape, it helps you to get all of the edge sanded at once. If you're just pushing it in a forward motion, you tend to actually just take off the leading edge. And again, if you're pulling it back towards you, you'll take off the leading edge coming towards you. By going in a figure of 8, you're hitting all of the parts of the piece that you want to sand. And you can just check it to see. You'll start to see that the edge starts to become flat. So you can see in some spots that it's quite flat, and in others it still needs sanding. So I'm just going to carry on. Just move the paper around a bit. Let's check that again. Again, that's getting there. There's still a couple of spots where that needs sanding down, so I'm just going to carry on for another couple of minutes. Whoops. Okay, so there we go. We've got a nice flat rim all the way around the piece, which means we'll be able to get that soldered to the retention ring really nicely. I'm going to make sure that the other half of my locket is sanded out nicely as well, and then we will go ahead and set up the soldering. Now that I've got both halves of my locket nicely sanded so the edges are flat, I'm going to set them up to solder the retention rings into place. I'm going to use some pieces of scrap copper to just keep this in place on my solder block. So just keep that so that it's not going to move too much. If you're using a charcoal block, you could carve out a little divot and then you can just drop the domed piece into it and it should keep it nice and stable for you. I'm going to use hard solder to solder the retention ring, and I'm going to be using spray flux. So this is slightly different to borax flux or to liquid flux. It doesn't get painted on. What you do is warm your piece up with your torch and then you spray this on. So this is actually Pepe Tool's Smart Flux. It's a similar solution to the Prips Flux that you can get, and it forms a really good protective coating on your metal, so it helps to not get fire stain on your metal, and it acts as a barrier and a flow flux, so you don't need two different types with this one. So we'll go ahead and get the piece warmed up with our hand torch, and then we'll get a coating of the flux on. You just put the flame around the piece, wait for that to start getting a little bit warm, and then give that a spray. You'll see that that puts a nice white coating on. So I'm going to add some pieces of hard solder just around the edge, and the flux will help them to stay put. There was a little bit of the spray flux on the copper that was still wet, so I just popped the solder pieces into that, and then that helps them stick to the already dried flux. Then I'm going to go ahead and put my retention disc on and just nudge that into place, and then we will go ahead and solder this. I'll add a little bit more flux onto the silver that's showing, and then we'll get that soldered into place. So I'll just gently heat the piece, add a little bit more flux, and then just continue heating around until we see that solder flow. So because the disc is thicker metal, the domed disc is thicker metal, we want to concentrate the flame mainly onto that. And we'll get that heated up. So we just work the flame all the way around. You should see the flux starting to change colour, and then at that point it won't be long after until the solder flows, and that's just starting to go on this side. And we just feather the flame around, because we know the solder will follow the heat, so we can just draw that solder all the way around. But making sure that we're not putting too much of the heat onto the retention ring at the top. And there we go, you can see that solder flash. So I'll repeat this with the other side, and then we'll pop both pieces in the pickle, and we'll be ready to start setting up to make the hinge. Now the pieces have come out of the pickle, I'm just going to clean up these edges with a file just to get them nice and flush. So I'm just going to brace this against my bench peg, and I'm using a number 2 cut flat file. And just keep turning that to make sure we're not filing any flat spots. Okay, I'm just going to quickly go over that with a buff stick. So that's that edge nice and cleaned up. So I'm going to do the same with the other side, and then we'll set up to create the hinge. I've tidied up the edges of both pieces of the locket, And what we're going to do now is file a groove into this side, which is where we will set the hinge. So the hinge is going to be made out of silver tube, and it needs to sit just slightly down into the gap between the two halves. You can try and balance it on here to solder, but it's a lot easier and it will give you a lot better hinge if you actually file a groove into here for this to sit down into. Because you need to keep the two pieces together while you're filing so that you don't file off in an angle, the best thing that you can do is to tape your pieces together just with some masking tape. So I'll get those taped together now. So you just need a piece of masking tape or painter's tape, nothing that's too sticky, but you obviously need to be able to keep the pieces together. You can use binding wire as well if you don't have any tape to hand. I just find that tape is the easiest one to use. So keep hold of your two pieces and try and keep them as together as possible. And then we'll just wrap that piece of tape around. And just keep checking to make sure that they haven't moved too much. I'll keep that taped in. I'll just push that around the bottom. Also gives you something else that you can hold on to if you've got a little bit of tape left at the bottom. But we'll just get that pushed in, and you can see that that just keeps it a little bit more stable than just trying to hold them together with your fingers. So I know that I'm going to put the hinge in here. I'm going to use a round needle file to start filing that groove. So again, I'm going to brace my piece against my bench pin. Keep holding it together, but obviously the tape is going to help you there. And we'll just start to file a groove so it's hitting both sides of the locket. Just keep checking to make sure that you're filing equally on both sides, and also be aware that your needle file is tapered, so it's going to be wider towards the handle end than it is towards the bottom edge. So after you've started to file that groove in, it's going to be good to turn the locket around and start filing back the other way, and that way you should get a nice even channel. So you can already see that that's started to make a nice indentation, but we need to make sure that's a little bit longer so that we've got enough space to put the hinge in. So I'm just going to keep filing at this, and I'll check it as well to make sure that it's going to fit properly. Just turn that round and come from the other side. Make sure that your pieces are held together nicely again. Okay, let's have a quick look and see. So that's going to sit in quite nicely, but I still want to elongate that channel so that we can make it a slightly longer hinge. We're not going to be going for a really long hinge because obviously it's only quite a small locket and it would look out of place, but we do need to make it big enough to be a nice working hinge that's going to help keep the locket nice and secure. Again, I'm just going to turn it back the other way just to make sure that I'm getting that channel an even depth and an even width. When you're using a needle file, it doesn't matter if you're using more of a sawing motion. you'll still get that cut from the file as you're pushing it. Let's just check that tube in there. Okay, and we can see that that's sitting in there nice and flat. I'm probably going to just extend the channel a weeny bit more just so that we can make sure that we've got a nice solder join for it, and so we've got that nice and secured. And I think that will be about right. So the next thing to do is to start cutting the hinge from the tube. So I'm just going to pop the locket to one side and then I'll show you how to cut that hinge.